Hare Krishna. So today we kind of decided to check a little bit upgraded system of sound recording. As you can see, there's microphone here, and I think the sound was pretty okay, but you know, if we can make it better, even if this black thing stuck in front of my face, it's also fine. Anyway, so today is the day. Today we actually starting the 10th canto, and there's a beautiful and long summary of 10th canto made by Srila Prabhupada. So we'll start with that. Why would we pass out on that? It's amazing, bird view, kind of looking at the whole 89, I think it's 89 chapters, right? 89 chapters of or maybe it's 90, whatever, a lot of chapters. By far the most chapters in the whole Bhagavatam. And yeah, we'll start with it. If you're watching it, if you're hearing it, if you find this is inspiring, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we are producing the videos every day. Every day we're reading from 10th canto, and whenever it is appropriate, whenever we have some special day in our Vaishnava calendar, we will just speak on that. Like day before yesterday was Narottam Das Thakur appearance day, so actually space it out and recorded it only yesterday. But anyway, we'll try to be always on point. And also we have a video on Varaha Dvadashi and Nityana Trayodashi. We actually started a few days ago, so very exciting to have this interesting task in front of me every day. And by far it was the most exciting thing that I'm doing in many years, I tell you that. That's for sure. Anyway, so if some of you will find it interesting or enlivening, even amazing, please shower your blessings. I know I'm a very unqualified person to do that, but the beauty of this that I'm mostly reading from our acharyas, so that's very difficult to go wrong. Still I can screw it up, but hope I will not. But it's definitely a task, a very enlivening task. Doing it every day, it's something which put a certain mark on my daily schedule, and I'm happy to be able to commit to that. And so I'm asking for your blessings to be able to do that in a long term. Okay, so here we go. 10th canto, the Summum Bonum. Summary of the 10th canto. Before that, we chant Mangalacharana, asking the blessings from Guru Srila Prabhupada and all the Vaishnavas. Om Ajnana-timirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshuranmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Mukam karoti vachalam pangum langayate girim yat kripatamaham vande Shri Guru Dinatarinam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yudapadakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragunatham Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaidam Savathutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha Vanchakalpadarupyasya Kripasimhubhya Vacha Paritanam Pavanepyo Vaishnavepyo Namo Namaha. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Sarasvate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pashyatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So just let me make sure for a second that this microphone records something. Yeah, it does. Good. Okay. So 10th canto, Summum Bonum, summary of 10th canto. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. A short description of each chapter of this 10th canto is as follows. The first chapter, which has 69 verses, describes Maharaja Parikshit's eagerness to learn about the incarnation of Lord Krishna, and it also tells how Kamsa killed the 6 sons of Devaki because of his fear of being killed by her 8th son. The second chapter contains 42 verses describing the entrance of Supreme Personality of Godhead Krishna into the womb of Devaki to fulfill his missions of killing Kamsa. When Lord Krishna was within Devaki's womb, all the demigods headed by Brahma offered prayers to the Lord. The third chapter contains 53 verses. This chapter describes the appearance of Lord Krishna as he is. The Lord's father and mother, understanding the Lord's appearance, offered prayers. Fearing Kamsa, the Lord Father brought the child from Mathura to Gokula, Vrindavan. The fourth chapter contains 46 verses, which tell of a prophecy by the goddess Chandika. After consulting demoniac friends, Kamsa began killing all the children born at that time, since he thought this would be to his benefit. The fifth chapter contains 32 verses describing how Nanda Maharaj performed the birth ceremony of Krishna and then went to Mathura, where he met Vasudeva. The sixth chapter contains 44 verses. In this chapter, Nanda Maharaj, following the advice of his friend Vasudeva, returns to Gokula, and on the way sees the dead body of the Putana demoness and is astonished at her having been killed by Krishna. The seventh chapter, which contains 37 verses, describes Maharaja Parikshit's enthusiasm to hear about the boyhood pastimes of Lord Krishna, who killed Shakatasura and Trinavartasura, and showed within his mouth the entire cosmic manifestation. In the 8th chapter, there are 52 verses which describe Gargamuni's performing the name-giving ceremony of Krishna and Balarama, and how Krishna and Balarama performed playful childish activities, crawling on the ground, trying to walk with their small legs, and stealing butter and breaking the pots. This chapter also describes the vision of the universal form. The 9th chapter, which has 23 verses, describe how Krishna disturbed his mother while she was churning butter, because she left Krishna to see to the stove where the milk was boiling, and did not allow him to suck her breast. Krishna was very angry and broke a pot of yogurt. To chastise her naughty child, Mother Yashoda wanted to bind him with rope, but every time she tried, she failed, because of the shortage of rope when the time came to knot it. In the 10th chapter, there are 43 verses. This chapter describes how Krishna, as Damodara, caused the twin Yamalarjuna trees to fall, and how the 2 demigods within the trees were delivered by the mercy of Krishna. In the 11th chapter, there are 59 verses. This chapter describes how Nanda Maharaja released Krishna from the ropes, and how Krishna showed his mercy to a fruit seller while exchanging grains for fruit, and how Nanda Maharaj and others decided to leave Gokula for Vrindavan, where Krishna killed Vritrasura and Bakasura. Chapter 12 contains 44 verses describing Krishna's pastimes with the coward boys in the forest and the killing of the demon named Aghasura. Chapter 13 contains 64 verses describing how Brahma stole Krishna's calves and his friends, the coward boys. Krishna expanded his pastime for 1 year, representing himself as the calves and boys in the forms exactly like their own. In this way, he bewildered Brahma, who at last surrendered when his illusion was over. The 14th chapter contains 61 verses. In this chapter, Brahma offers prayers to Krishna after fully understanding him to be the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The 15th chapter contains 52 verses. This chapter describes how Krishna entered Talavan forest with Balaram, how Balaram killed Dhenukasura, and how Krishna protected the coward boys and cows from the poisonous effect of Kaliya. The 17th chapter contains 67 verses. This chapter describes the chastisement of Kaliya by Krishna, and it also describes the prayer offered by Kaliya's wives. In the 17th chapter, there are 25 verses. This chapter describes why Kaliya entered the river Yamuna after leaving his home, Nagalaya, one of the Dvipas, which according to some corresponds to the Fiji Islands. This chapter also describes how Garuda was cursed by Saubhari Rishi, how the coward boys, Krishna's friends, were enlivened when Krishna emerged from Yamuna, and how Krishna stopped the forest fire and saved the sleeping inhabitants of Vraja. The 18th chapter contains 32 verses giving description of Krishna and Balaram, their picnic within the forest, and the climate of Vrindavan in the summer and the spring, and Lord Balarama's killing of Pralambasura. Chapter 19 contains 16 verses describing Krishna's entering the forest known as Munjaranya, saving the coward boys and cows from the forest fire and bringing them to Bandiravan. Chapter 20 contains 49 verses. This chapter describes the enjoyment of Balaram and Krishna in the forest with the coward boys during the rainy season, and it gives various instruction through analogies concerning the rainy season and autumn. Chapter 21 contains 20 verses describing how Krishna entered the forest of Vrindavan in the autumn, playing his flute, and how he attracted the gopis who were singing his glories. The 22nd chapter contains 38 verses describing how the gopis prayed to the goddess Katyayani to obtain Krishna as their husband, and how Krishna later stole the garments of the gopis while the gopis were bathing in the Yamuna. The 23rd chapter contains 52 verses describing how the coward boys, being very hungry, followed Krishna's direction by begging some food for him and themselves from Brahmanas engaged in performing yagyas. The Brahmanas refused to give food to Krishna and Balaram, although the boys begged for it. But the wives of the Brahmanas agreed, and therefore Krishna bestowed his mercy upon them. The 24th chapter contains 38 verses describing how Krishna defied King Indra despite Indra's position of prestige by stopping the Indra Yagya and instead worshipping Govardhan. The 25th chapter contains 33 verses as described in this chapter. Because the Indra Yagya was stopped, King Indra was very angry, and to kill the inhabitants of Vrindavan, Vraja, he flooded the entire area with rain. Krishna, however, accepted King Indra's challenge by lifting Govardhan hill as an umbrella to protect Vrindavan and all the cows. The 26th chapter contains 25 verses describing how Nanda Maharaj, seeing the extraordinary activities of Krishna, was struck with wonder, and how he thus narrated for all the coward men the whole story of Krishna's opulence as foretold by Garga Muni. Chapter 27, which contains 28 verses, describes how King Indra, upon seeing Krishna's unlimited power, worshipped Lord Krishna, who was fully washed with milk supplied by the Surabhi, and who thus became known as Govinda. The 28th chapter contains 17 verses. In this chapter, Krishna saves his father, Nanda Maharaja, from the custody of Varuna and shows the coward man how Vaikuntha Loka is situated. The 29th chapter contains 48 verses describing how Krishna talked to the gopis before performing the Rasa Lila, and how, after the beginning of the Rasa Lila, Krishna disappeared from the scene. Chapter 30 contains 44 verses describing how the gopis, being separated from Krishna, went mad and began to wander in the forest in search of him. The gopis met Srimadi Radharani, the daughter of King Vrishabhanu, and they all wandered on the bank of the Yamuna searching for Krishna. Chapter 31 contains 19 verses describing how the bereaved gopis waited in great anxiety to meet Krishna. Chapter 32 contains 22 verses. In this chapter, Krishna appears among the gopis who are fully satisfied in ecstatic love for him. Chapter 33 contains 39 verses. In this chapter, Krishna appears in multi-forms in the midst of the gopis, with whom he dances in the Rasa dance. Then they all bathe in River Yamuna. Also in this chapter, Shukadeva mitigates the doubts of Parikshit concerning the performance of the Rasa Lila. Chapter 34 contains 32 verses. This chapter describes how Nanda Maharaja, Krishna's father, was swallowed by a big python, who had been a demigod named Vidyadhara, but was cursed by Angira Rishi. Krishna rescued his father and saved this demigod simultaneously. Chapter 35 contains 26 verses. This chapter describes how Krishna went to the pasturing ground with the cows and how the gopis sang in separation from him. Chapter 36 contains 40 verses. This chapter describes Krishna's killing of Arishtasura and also describes Nanda's disclosure to Kamsa that Narada's disclosure to Kamsa that both Rama and Krishna were sons of Vasudeva. Because of this disclosure, Kamsa arranged to kill both Rama and Krishna. He sent his assistant Keshi to Vrindavan, and later he sent Akrura to bring Rama and Krishna to Mathura. Chapter 37 contains 33 verses. In this chapter, Krishna kills the Keshi demon. Narada worships Krishna by narrating his future activities, and Krishna kills the demon named Vyomasura. Chapter 38 contains 43 verses. This chapter describes how Akrura went to Vrindavan and how he was received by Ramakrishna and Nanda Maharaja. Chapter 39 contains 57 verses. This chapter describes how Rama and Krishna, having been invited by Kamsa, started for Mathura. While they were ready on the chariot, the gopis began to cry, and Krishna sent his messenger to pacify them. Thus, he was able to travel toward Mathura. On the way, Akrura was shown the entire Vaikuntha Loka within the water of the Yamuna. Chapter 40 contains 30 verses in which the prayers of Akrura are described. Chapter 41, which contains 52 verses, describes the entrance of Rama and Krishna into the city of Mathura, where the ladies were very jubilant to see these two brothers. Krishna killed a washerman, glorified Sudama, and gave Sudama his benediction. Chapter 42, which contains 38 verses, describe how Krishna delivered Kubja and how he broke Kamsa's gigantic bow and killed its caretakers. Thus Kamsa and Krishna met. Chapter 43 contains 40 verses. Outside the sporting arena of Kamsa, Krishna killed an elephant named Kuvalayapida. Then he entered the arena and spoke with Chanura. Chapter 44, which contains 51 verses, describes how Krishna and Balarama killed the wrestlers named Chanura and Mushtika, and thereafter killed Kamsa and his 8 brothers. Krishna, however, pacified Kamsa's wives and his own father and mother, Vasudeva and Devaki. Chapter 45 contains 50 verses. This chapter describes how Krishna pacified his father and mother and celebrated the enthronement of his grandfather Ugrasena. After promising the inhabitants of Vrindavan that he would return very soon, Krishna underwent ritualistic ceremonies as a kshatriya. He took a vow of brahmacharya and lived in the Gurukula, where he studied regularly. By killing the demon named Panchajana, he received a conch shell named Panchajanya. Krishna rescued the son of his guru from the custody of Yamaraja and returned him. After thus offering Guru Dakshana to repay his teacher, Lord Krishna returned to Mathura Puri. Chapter 46 contains 49 verses. As described in this chapter, Krishna sent Uddhava to Vrindavan to pacify his father and mother, Nanda Maharaja and Yashoda. Chapter 47 contains 69 verses describing how Uddhava, following Krishna's order, went to pacify the gopis and then returned to Mathura. Thus Uddhava appreciated the ecstatic love felt for Krishna by the inhabitants of Vrindavan. Chapter 48 contains 36 verses. This chapter describes how Krishna fulfilled the desire of Kubja by going to her house and enjoying her. Krishna then went to the home of Akrura. Satisfied by Akrura's prayers, Krishna praised him very much and sent him to Hastinapur to gather information about the Pandavas. Chapter 49 contains 31 verses. As described in this chapter, Akrura, following Krishna's orders, went to Hastinapur, where he met Vidura and Kunti and heard from them about Dhritarashtra's mistreatment of the Pandavas. Informed of the Pandavas' faith in Krishna, Akrura advised Dhritarashtra, and after understanding Dhritarashtra's mind, he returned to Mathura, where he described everything about the situation in Hastinapur. Chapter 50 contains 57 verses. In this chapter, Jarasandha, having heard that his son-in-law Kamsa was killed, attacked Mathura to kill Rama and Krishna, but was defeated 17 times. When Jarasandha was about to attack for the 18th time, Kalayavana, having been advised by Narada, also attacked Mathura. Thus, the Yadava dynasty entered a fort in the midst of the water and lived there by mystic power. After giving full protection to the Yadava dynasty and conferring with Lord Baladeva, Lord Krishna emerged from Dwaraka. Chapter 51, which contains 63 verses, describe how Muchukunda killed Kalayavana simply by glancing upon him. Chapter 52 contains 44 verses. In this chapter, Muchukunda offers prayers to Krishna, and then Krishna kills all the soldiers of Kalayavana and returns to Dwaraka within their booty. Then Jarasandha attacked Mathura again. Rama and Krishna, as if afraid of him, fled to the top of a mountain, to which Jarasandha then set fire. Unseen by Jarasandha, Krishna and Balarama jumped from the mountain and entered Dwaraka, which was surrounded by the sea. Jarasandha, thinking that Krishna and Balarama had been killed, returned with his soldiers to his own country, and Krishna continued to live in Dwaraka. Rukmini, the daughter of Vidarbha, was very much attracted to Krishna, and she sent Krishna a letter through Brahmana. Chapter 53 contains 57 verses. Following Rukmini's request, Krishna went to the city of Vidarbha and kidnapped her in the presence of such enemies as Jarasandha. Chapter 54 contains 60 verses. As described in this chapter, Krishna defeated all the opposing princes and disfigured Rukmini's brother Rukmi. Then Krishna returned with Rukmini to Dwaraka, where they were united in a regular marriage. Rukmini, however, remained in a place known as Bojakata, being angry at his brother-in-law Krishna. Rukmi, however, remained in a place known as Bojakata, being angry at his brother-in-law Krishna. Chapter 55, containing 40 verses, describes the birth of Pradyumna, how Pradyumna was kidnapped by Shambarasura, and how Pradyumna later killed Shambarasura and returned to Dwaraka with his wife Rati Devi. Chapter 56 contains 45 verses. As described in this chapter, King Satrajit, by the mercy of the sun god, received a jewel named Syamantaka. Later, when this jewel was stolen, Satyajit unnecessarily became doubtful of Krishna, but Krishna, to vindicate his position, retrieved the jewel along with the daughter of Jambavan. Krishna later married Satyajit's daughter and received a full dowry, as described in chapter 57, which contained 42 verses. Both Balaram and Krishna went to Hastinapur. Having heard about the fire in the Shelak house of the Pandavas after Satyajit was killed by Shatadanava at the instigation of Akrura and Kritavarma, Balaram and Krishna returned to Dwaraka. Shatadanava left the Syamantaka jewel with Akrura and fled to the forest. Thus, although Krishna killed Shatadanava, he was unable to retrieve the jewel. Finally, the jewel was discovered and awarded to Akrura. Chapter 58 contains 58 verses. After the Pandavas finished living incognita in the forest, Krishna went to Indraprastha to see them. He then married 5 wives headed by Kalindi. After Krishna and Arjuna set fire to the Khandava forest, Arjuna received the Gandiva bow. The demon Mayadanava constructed an assembly house for the Pandavas, and Duryodhana was very much aggrieved. Chapter 59 contains 45 verses. In this chapter, Krishna, at the request of Indra, kills the demon Narakasura, the son of the earth personified, along with the demon associate headed by Mura. The earth personified offers prayers to Krishna and returns to him all the paraphernalia which Narakasura has stolen. Krishna then bestows fearlessness upon the son of Narakasura and marries the 16,000 princesses whom the demon kidnapped. Also, in this chapter, Krishna takes away the Parijata plant from the heavenly planets, and the foolishness of Indra and others is described. Chapter 60 contains 59 verses. In this chapter, Krishna makes Rukmini angry with his joking words. Krishna pacifies Rukmini, and there is a lover's quarrel between them. Chapter 61 contains 40 verses. This chapter contains a description of the sons and grandsons of Krishna. At the time of Aniruddha's marriage, Balarama kills Rukmi and breaks the teeth of the king of Kalinga. Chapter 62 contains 33 verses. This chapter begins the discourse concerning the abduction of Usha, the daughter of Banasura, and the amorous pastime between Usha and Aniruddha. It also describes the fight between Aniruddha and Banasura and how Banasura seized Aniruddha with a snake noose. Chapter 63, which contains 53 verses, describes how the strength of Lord Shiva was defeated in the battle between Banasura and the Yadavas. The Raudra Dvara, having been defeated by the Vaishnava Dvara, offered prayers to Krishna. Krishna severed all by 4 of Bana's 1,000 arms and thus showed him mercy. Krishna then returned to Dwaraka with Usha and Aniruddha. Chapter 64 contains 44 verses. In this chapter, Krishna liberates King Nriga, the son of Ikshvaku, from the curse and instructs all kings by explaining the fault in misappropriating the property of a Brahmana. In connection with the deliverance of King Nriga, there are instructions for the Yadavas, who were puffed up with pride due to wealth, opulence, enjoyment, and so on. Chapter 65 contains 64 verses. As described in this chapter, Lord Baladeva, desiring to see his friends and relatives, went to Gokula. In the months of Chaitra and Vishaka, in the groves by the Yamuna, Lord Balaram performed the Rasa Rasotsava and Yamuna Karshana Leelas in the association of his gopis. Rasa Rasotsava and Yamuna Karshana Leelas. As described in chapter 66, which contains 43 verses, Krishna went to Kashi and then killed Paundraka, as well as his friend, the king of Kashi, Sudakshina, and others. Chapter 67, which contains 28 verses, describes how Lord Baladeva, while enjoying with many young girls on the Raivataka mountain, vanquished the extremely mischievous ape Dvivida, who was the brother of Mainda and the friend of Narakasuras. Chapter 68 has 54 verses. As described in this chapter, when Samba, the son of Jambavati, kidnapped Lakshmana, the daughter of Duryodhana, he was captured in the fight with the Kauravas. In order to free him and establish peace, Lord Baladeva went to Hastinapur as a well-wisher. The Kauravas, however, were uncooperative, and upon seeing their arrogance, Lord Baladeva began pulling the city of Hastinapur with his plough. The Kauravas, headed by Duryodhana, offered prayers to Lord Baladeva, who then returned to Dwaraka with Samba and Lakshmana. Chapter 69 contains 45 verses. As described in this chapter, Krishna exhibited his household life with his 16,000 wives. Even the great sage Narada was astonished at how Krishna, having expanded himself into 16,000 forms, was conducting his household life. Thus Narada offered prayers to Lord Krishna, and Krishna was very much pleased with him. Chapter 70, which contains 47 verses, describes how Krishna exhibited his daily ritualistic ceremonies and how he released the kings arrested by Jarasandha. While Lord Krishna was receiving a messenger sent by these kings, Narada came to see Krishna and told him news of the Pandavas. Narada informed Krishna that the Pandavas desired to perform Rajasuya sacrifice, and Krishna agreed to attend it. But he first asked for Uddhava's decision about whether to give preference to killing King Jarasandha or performing the Rajasuya Yagya. Chapter 71 contains 45 verses describing the happiness of the Pandavas when Krishna went to Indraprastha. By the inconceivable desire of Krishna, Jarasandha would be killed and the Rajasuya Yagya would be performed by Maharaja Yudhishthira. Chapter 72 contains 46 verses. By agreeing to perform the Rajasuya Yagya, Krishna gave Maharaja Yudhishthira great pleasure. This chapter also described the killing of Jarasandha, the enthroning of his son, and the release of the kings whom Jarasandha had arrested. Chapter 73 contains 35 verses. After Lord Krishna released the kings and restored their royal power, he was worshipped by Sahadeva, the son of Jarasandha. And then he returned to Indraprastha with Bhima and Arjuna. Chapter 74 contains 54 verses. Maharaj Yudhishthira offered prayers to Krishna and offered him the first worship in the Rajasuya Yagya. To honor the Lord in this way is the foremost duty of every man, but this was intolerable to Shishupala, the king of Chedi. Shishupala began to blaspheme Krishna, who thus severed the king's head from his body and awarded him the salvation called Sarupya Mukti. After the conclusion of Rajasuya sacrifice, Krishna returned to Dwaraka with his queens. Chapter 75 contains 40 verses. As described in this chapter, Maharaj Yudhishthira, after the Rajasuya Yagya, performed the final ritualistic bathing ceremonies. Duryodhana was bewildered in the palace constructed by Mayadanava, and thus he felt insulted. Chapter 76 contains 33 verses describing how Shalva, one of the kings King Krishna defeated when he kidnapped Rukmini, decided to rid the entire world of the Yadavas. To defeat the Yadavas, Shalva worshipped Lord Shiva, who rewarded him with the aerial car named Shobha. When Shalva fought with the Vrishnis, Pradyumna smashed the car designed by Mayadanava, but he was attacked by Shalva's brother, whose name was Dhuman. Beaten unconscious by Dhuman's club, Pradyumna was carried some distance away from the warfield by his charioteer, but later he lamented having been removed from the battlefield. Chapter 77 contains 37 verses. In this chapter, Pradyumna recovers from his injuries and begins fighting with Shalva. When Krishna returned to Dwaraka from Indraprastha, he immediately went to the battlefield where Shalva and Pradyumna were fighting. There, he killed Shalva, although Shalva was powerfully equipped with illusory weapons. Chapter 78 contains 40 verses. As described in this chapter, a friend of Shalva's named Dantavakra and Dantavakra's brother Viduratha were killed by Sri Krishna. Instead of taking part in the fighting between the Kauravas and the Pandavas, Baladeva, who had been staying at Dvarakapuri, went touring holy places. Because of the misbehavior of Ramaharshana, Baladev killed him at Naimisharanya and appointed his son Ugrashrava Sutta Goswami as a speaker of Srimad Bhagavatam to continue the discourse on the Puranas. He appointed Sutta Goswami as a speaker of Srimad Bhagavatam to continue the discourse on the Puranas. Chapter 79 contains 34 verses. This chapter describes how the Brahmanas of Naimisharanya advised Baladeva to atone for the death of Ramaharshana. After killing a demon named Balvala, Baladeva traveled and bathed in holy places until he at last came to the battlefield of Kurukshetra, where Bhima and Duryodhana were fighting. Then he returned to Dwaraka and went again to Naimisharanya, where he instructed the rishis. Then he left with his wife Revati. Chapter 80, which contains 45 verses, describes how Sudama Vipra, a friend of Krishna's, approached Krishna for money and was worshipped by Krishna, who reminiscent with him about their boyhood at Gurukula. Chapter 81 contains 41 verses. This chapter described the friendly talks between Krishna and his friend Sudama. Krishna very gladly accepted a gift of flat rice from Sudama Vipra. When Sudama Vipra returned home, he saw that everything there was wonderfully opulent, and he praised the friendship of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. With the gifts of the Lord, he enjoyed material opulence, and later he was promoted back home, back to Godhead. Chapter 82 contains 48 verses. This chapter described how the Yadavas went to Kurukshetra because of a solar eclipse, and how other kings spoke to them of Krishna. At that meeting, Krishna satisfied Nanda Maharaja and the residents of Vrindavan who had also come there. Chapter 83 contains 43 verses describing how the women assembled at Kurukshetra engaged in topics of Sri Krishna, and how Draupadi asked all Krishna's queens about how they had married him. Chapter 84 contains 71 verses. As described in this chapter, when great sages went to see Krishna at Kurukshetra, Krishna took this opportunity to praise them. Because Vasudeva desired to perform a great sacrifice on this occasion, the sage advised him regarding worship of Krishna and the Supreme Personality. The sages advised him regarding worship of Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. After the yagya was performed, all who were present dispersed to their respective abodes. Chapter 85 contains 59 verses. At the request of his father and mother, Krishna, by his mercy returned their dead sons, all of whom were liberated. Chapter 86 contains 59 verses. This chapter describes how Arjuna kidnapped Subhadra with a great fight. It also describes how Krishna went to Mithila to favor his devotee Bahulashva and stay at the house of Shrutadeva and advise them about spiritual advancement. Chapter 87 contains 50 verses describing the prayers offered to Narayana by the Vedas. Chapter 88 contains 40 verses. This chapter describes how Vaishnavas became transcendental by worshipping Lord Vishnu and then returned home back to Godhead. By worship of demigods, one may get material power, but this chapter describes how an ordinary living being in the material world can be favored by Lord Shri Krishna and it establishes Lord Vishnu's supremacy above Lord Brahma and Lord Shiva. Chapter 89 contains 65 verses disclosing who is the best among material deities. Although Vishnu is among the three deities, Brahma, Vishnu, and Maheshwara, he is transcendental and supreme. In this chapter, we also find a description of how Krishna and Arjuna went to Mahakalapura to deliver the son of a Dvaraka Brahmana, and how Arjuna was astonished. Chapter 90 contains 50 verses. This chapter summarizes Krishna's Leelas and presents the logic of Madhurena Samapayet, establishing that everything ends well in transcendental bliss. Okay, so that was the big summary by Srila Prabhupada of the 10th canto. So we see that Srila Prabhupada, in the beginning of this movement, he wrote Krishna book, which is a summary study of the 10th canto. And then, before writing 10th canto, before actually starting to his comments, purports, writing his purports and translating the 10th canto, he actually summarized the whole 10th canto yet again. This is something, because he knew that he might not be able to finish the whole 10th canto, so he wanted to give as much as possible. And we know Srila Prabhupada, I think, either 13 or 14 chapters of 10th canto was finished by Srila Prabhupada. I'm not sure. Definitely nothing beyond 14th chapter. I'm not sure if the 14th chapter was actually translated and commented by Srila Prabhupada. We'll find this out very soon. But it also reminds of how Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami was writing Chaitanya Charitamrita, right? He was, in the beginning of Madhya Lila, he summarized the second chapter of Madhya Lila, as far as I remember, summarizes the whole Antya Lila, because he said, I'm old and I'm invalid and I don't know if I will be able to finish. So just in case I summarize the whole thing, then I continue. Like that, So it's a very, Vaishnavas try to do their best to share their knowledge, to share the wisdom with the world, and they try to do it in a most urgent way, because they know that they have been on this planet in Krishna's hand. They know it better than everybody, although everybody's been on this planet is in Krishna's hands, but for most it's indirectly in the hands of Lord's external energy. But the great Vaishnavas, they have missions, and they want to make sure that they serve the Lord to the max. So that was Srila Prabhupada's way of doing that he left the summary of 10th canto and then he summarized the 10th canto before he started translating it. Anyway, before we move to the first, readings, the first chapter, there's also a summary of each chapter as well. It's amazing. So it's almost like a Krishna book, but shorter than Krishna book chapter. So that would be it for today. Tomorrow we'll continue with the first chapter. If you like this type of content, please subscribe to the channel, and we put the videos out every day, just reading from Srimad Bhagavatam 10th canto. Then also we try to honor each day in Vaishnava calendar. You could see other videos on the channel, which we started maybe a week ago or something. And yes, I hope this is something with which I can serve you and get the blessings of the Vaishnavas and get purified. Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Nidai Gaura Premanande Hari Hari Bol.